Good evening, Rappahannock Valley Civil War Roundtable. Tonight, we are honored to have as our guest speaker, Dwight Hughes. Dwight is a public historian, an author, and a speaker on Civil War naval history. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1967 with a major in history and government, and he served 20 years as a Navy surface warfare officer on most of the world's oceans and ships ranging from destroyer to aircraft carrier, with the river forces in Vietnam, where he earned his Bronze Star for Meritorious Service, along with a Purple Heart. As a lieutenant commander, our speaker taught naval ROTC at the University of Rochester, earning an MA in political science, and he later earned an MS in information systems management from USC. In his final sea tour, Commander Hughes planned and conducted convoy exercises with over 20 ships of the Maritime Preposition Force based out of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. And if you've never been there, count yourself lucky. And after he transitioned to civilian career, he was a software engineer, primarily in geographic feature naming data and electronic mapping, under contract for the U.S. Geological Survey. A ridge in Antarctica is actually named after him in recognition of contributions to Antarctic databases and information services. Finally, our speaker is the author of a Confederate biography, The Cruise of the CSS Shenandoah, which is out of the Naval Institute Press in 2015, and a contributing author at the Emerging Civil War blog. His new book for the Emerging Civil War series, which is the topic of tonight's discussion, titled Unlike Anything That Ever Floated, the Monitor and Virginia and the Battle of Hampton Roads, March 8th and 9th, 1862, out of Savas Beatty, was published in March of 2021. He has presented at numerous Civil War roundtables, historical conferences, and other venues. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand this over to Dwight.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. I'm going to share my slide screen with you here. Okay, everybody see the slides okay? Good. So let's get going here. On Saturday, March 8th, 1862, at around 4 p.m., the USS Monitor steamed into Chesapeake Bay after rushing down from New York through gale force winds, almost sinking in the process. Monitor's mission: to defeat the Confederate ironclad, the CSS Virginia, before she destroyed the wooden warships of the Union fleet in Hampton Roads. Monitor was a steam-propelled, iron-plated raft with a cylindrical iron turret and two 11-inch guns. The flat expanse of deck was barely 1.5 feet above the surface. 14 officers and 57 crewmen were encased in the hull below the waterline. The captain ordered an exhausted and dispirited crew to strip the vessel of her sea rig and make all preparations for battle. To mid-19th century mariners, this enclosed, cramped, artificial space, which resembled future submarines, was a radical departure from sailing and fighting on the open decks and in the high rigging of a traditional man of war, and not a little intimidating. Monitor redefined the relationship between men and machines in war, challenging ancient concepts of honor and valor. These developments paralleled the transformative combat experience of soldiers who began the conflict standing up in open fields, manfully confronting the enemy face to face, but ended up burrowing into trenches and crouching behind elaborate fortifications. Technology had advanced the defense over the offense. Paymaster William Keeler wrote to his wife, You may rest assured that your better half will be in no more danger from rebel compliments than if he was seated with you at home. There isn't danger enough to give us any glory. Not a man is exposed in action, and our boilers and our entire machinery are completely and effectually protected. Monitor would become a cultural icon of American industrial strength and ingenuity in advertisements for everything from whiskey to refrigerators. She embodied social and institutional as well as industrial revolutions. But this would be a symbolic role, which would outshine her accomplishments beyond a single engagement in a specific set of circumstances. After the battle, the Union caught monitor fever. 50 monitors would be built in a bewildering range of 1, 2, and 3 turret classes. But as a warship type, they were of limited utility. With low profile, monitors were not seagoing vessels and were not effective against shore fortifications, although they did neutralize several Confederate ironclads. The most important technical innovation was the rotating armored turret, which would evolve into 20th century battleships. But during Monitor's construction, public opinion had been decidedly ambivalent concerning this strange watercraft. The technological transition in one generation from timeless horse-drawn transportation to huge puffing locomotives had been breathtaking. But on the water, tall warships had always inspired awe, and so far, they look much the same, even when driven by steam as well as sail. It was not clear where little Monitor fit in this revolution. Was she even a ship, or just a small ironclad 2-gun battery? Many could not conceive that a slab of iron would float. One Vermont reporter could hardly find words to describe the thing. She is, in fact, unlike anything that ever floated on Neptune's bosom. Viewed from a distance, he said, Monitor looked insignificant and harmless. But standing on its deck, she appeared powerful and invulnerable. This sea monster resembled the Leviathan of the scriptures. The vessel had a most singular appearance, wrote one officer. From a half-mile distance, she appeared to be sinking. The hull was not visible, while the turret sat upon the water by itself. People said she looked like a washtub on a raft, a cheese box on a plank, a hat on a shingle, etc., etc. Nathaniel Hawthorne would write, "It looked like a gigantic rat trap. It was ugly, questionable, suspicious, evidently mischievous. Nay, I will say some will call it devilish." There we go. Sorry. Monitor's captain, John L. Warden, recalled, "Here was an unknown, untried vessel with but a small portion below the waterline, her crew to live with the ocean beating over their heads. An iron coffin-like ship of which the gloomiest predictions were made, with their crew shut out from sunlight and the air above the sea, depending entirely on artificial means to supply the air they breathe. A failure of the machinery would be almost certain death to her men." Monitor proceeded across Chesapeake Bay as evening descended. They heard heavy guns in the distance. Plumes of smoke hung over the land. Little black spots sprang into the air, paused for a moment, and expanded into large white clouds. Gun flashes lit the darkening horizon. Bursting shells flashed in the air. The pilot boarded and informed them that the dreaded Virginia was raking havoc in Hampton Roads. The USS Cumberland was sunk. The USS Congress was ablaze. Vessels were fleeing like a covey of frightened quails. Their lights danced over the water in all directions. The steam frigate Minnesota, the most powerful ship the Navy could deploy, had run hard to ground off Newport News earlier in the day while pursuing the marauding Virginia. The rebel monster surely would return in the morning to complete her destruction. Worden was ordered to take Monitor to defend Minnesota. An atmosphere of gloom pervaded the fleet, recalled Monitor's Lieutenant Green. The pygmy aspect of the newcomer did not inspire confidence among those who had witnessed the destruction of the day before. Congress blazed like a gigantic torch stuck in the mud where she had been pulverized by Virginia. Around 2 a.m., she blew up. Certainly a grander sight was never seen, wrote Lieutenant Green, but it went straight to the marrow of our bones. Near us, too, at the bottom of the river, lay the Cumberland, with her silent crew of brave men who died while fighting their guns to the water's edge. The USS Monitor entered Hampton Roads, cleared for action, and anchored near Minnesota. Her journey to this point had been as unprecedented as the impending battle. So let us step back a bit and look at her origins. A furious arms race was on in Europe. New developments in naval armaments, larger guns, explosive shells, rifled bores, had rendered wooden warships increasingly vulnerable. Significant improvements had been made in iron armor, as demonstrated in the recent Crimean War. Whoop, I'm hand on the wrong button there. Sorry, there we go. The French launched the first ironclad battleship, the Gloire, in November 1859. In 1860, the British produced the magnificent HMS Warrior, the first warship with a wholly iron hull and the most advanced, most powerful in the world. The US Navy had been in the forefront of developments in steam propulsion and naval armaments. In the 1840s and 50s, the Navy ceased building sail-only warships while developing advanced wooden steam cruisers, culminating in the Merrimack frigate class. These powerful warships were equal or superior to conventional European frigates. But Americans had no far-flung empire to defend and no neighboring threats. Naval strategy focused on harbor and coastal defense, with swift cruisers like Merrimack to protect commerce in distant waters. They let the Europeans pursue costly experiments in the unproven technology of iron armor. Then secession altered the strategic picture dramatically. In Europe, the war disrupted industry, trade, and finance, caused high unemployment and social and political unrest. Great Britain seriously considered intervening on behalf of the Confederacy, perhaps forcefully. British support for rebel commerce raiders and blockade running enraged the United States. Arguments over the responsibilities of neutral countries in wartime harken back to 1812 and the Revolution. The specter of a third war with Great Britain, the world's most powerful nation, now armed with seagoing ironclads, became real and immediate. In the summer of 1861, Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles struggled with the notion of ironclad vessels. It was a subject full of difficulty and doubt, he told Congress. England and France had built large, powerful seagoing ironclads. The United States had none. It was evident that a new and material element in maritime warfare was developing itself and demanded immediate attention. Iowa Senator James Grimes supported the development of ironclads. We need a more effective blockade, he wrote. Scoundrels north as well as scoundrels south are carrying on an unlawful trade and fraud of our revenue. Pirates and sea rovers must be captured. Southern harbors and forts must be retaken. Commerce must be protected and northern harbors defended. Suppose England, in her love for cotton, should attempt to break our blockade, and we should get in trouble with her. What is to become of our northern cities and our cities upon the coast? Secretary Wells was overseeing an immense, unprecedented warship procurement and building program while instigating a nearly impossible continent-wide blockade. Without further study, he concluded, it would not be advisable to commit heavy expenditures by way of experiment on unproven technology. The most immediate threats were Confederate ironclads under construction in Norfolk, Mobile, and New Orleans, particularly the former USS Merrimack, which would become the CSS Virginia. The Mobile Register boasted that this new weapon would be a floating fortress that will be able to defeat the whole Navy of the United States and bombard its cities. With their great size, strength, powerful engines, and invulnerable iron casing, she would easily destroy or disperse the blockading fleet. She could throw bombs into Fort Monroe. We hope to soon to hear that she is ready to commence her avenging career on the seas. Northern public opinion was aroused also. The Philadelphia Examiner thought it curious that the United States should be so behind the age. If we intend to have a national naval force worthy of our power and pretensions, we shall have to build iron-cased vessels as France and England have done and are doing. Congress directed Secretary Wells to appoint an ironclad board to investigate plans and specifications for constructing iron or steel-clad steamships or steam batteries, appropriating for the purpose $1.5 million. He selected 3 senior line officers, 2 commodores, crusty old salts of the wood and canvas Navy, veterans of the War of 1812, and 1 commander. The board advertised for proposals and from them recommended 3 designs. To confront the potential European threat, the first 2 were conventional wooden hulls with iron cladding, broadside battery, auxiliary steam engines, and a sailing rig. They would become the USS New Ironsides and the USS Galena. The final board selection was proposed by a Swedish engineer named John Ericsson. The intense, stocky Ericsson, born in 1803, had a long career in Sweden, England, and America, designing, building, and improving steam engines. He produced a host of inventions, including the shipboard steam condenser, and collected numerous patents. Ericsson's proposal possessed, recalled Secretary Wells, extraordinary and valuable features for coast and river blockade. It involved a revolution in naval warfare. President Lincoln remarked, "All I have to say is what the girl said when she put her foot into the stocking. It strikes me there's something in it." Ericsson's low-profile concept was inspired by Swedish lumber rafts. He never claimed to have invented the revolving armored turret. The idea had been circulating among engineers for decades, but he was the first to successfully deploy it. The ironclad board had serious reservations, but reluctantly agreed to proceed. The plan addressed the critical requirement, a combat-ready craft suitable for restricted waters to be rapidly constructed and deployed. In its favor were presumed invulnerability, small size, shallow draft, and limited exposed target area. Worrisome unknowns, however, included over-reliance on steam power, semi-submerged hull, questionable stability, and untried turret-mounted armament. Monitor also was unseaworthy and an uncomfortable and cramped environment to operate guns and steam machinery. The contract was signed on October 4th, 1861 for an ironclad shot-proof steam battery. John Ericsson and his backers were to deliver the vessel complete and ready for service within the unprecedented span of 100 days for a price of $275,000. Ericsson began a frenetic and incredibly complex manufacturing process never used before for for naval ships, using civilian facilities because Navy shipyards had no capabilities to produce ironclads. He orchestrated a conglomerate of 9 contractors and multiple subcontractors working simultaneously in at least 7 Northeast cities to produce raw materials, angle iron, bar iron, plate iron, rivets, and finished components for assembly at Continental Iron Works in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. Most of these firms clustered around New York City and Albany, centers of steam engine and iron manufacturing. They applied methods and materials in common use for locomotives and other land products. Only Yankees could produce an experimental ironclad vessel from scratch in 100 days. Despite the rush, Erickson did not scrimp on furnishings and gadgets. The officers' closet-sized staterooms were appointed in Victorian opulence, while crewmen slept in hammocks on the more utilitarian berth deck. 6-inch round glass windows or deck lights set in the deck overhead, supplemented by oil lamps, provided meager illumination. Erickson crafted a compact 400 horsepower steam engine with a single cylinder 40 inches in diameter, driving 2 horizontal pistons. Auxiliary steam engines, an uncommon feature at the time, drove the turret and ventilation blowers. A steam condenser provided fresh water. The guns were mounted in customized low-profile friction carriages to dampen recoil in the confined turret. Erickson installed the first custom-designed, pressure-flushing, below-the-waterline water closets, or heads. The ship's surgeon operated the flushing valves in the wrong order and suffered the indignity of being blown off the seat by a jet of water. Gideon Wells selected 27-year veteran Lieutenant John L. Warden to command Monitor. Warden had been captured by Confederates the previous year while running secret dispatches to Fort Pickens in Florida, becoming the conflict's first prisoner of war. Confined in Alabama for 8 months before being exchanged, Warden was still ill and weak when he assumed command. Lieutenant Samuel Dana Green was named executive officer, second in command. The 22-year-old Marylander graduated from the new United States Naval Academy at Annapolis in June 1859. Green represented the young professional officer corps, educated at the New School, steeped in new technology, and fired in the crucible of war to lead the Navy into the 20th century. On the drizzly morning of January 30th, 1862, Monitor slid down the ways into the East River before a large spontaneous crowd. The New York Tribune wrote, "The assemblage cheered rapturously as the strange-looking craft glided swiftly and gracefully into its new element. Nearby vessels fired salutes. Predictions that she would break her back or swamp upon launching were disproven. The CSS Virginia was expected to appear in Hampton Roads any day, so work continued around the clock to complete fitting out. Despite futile attempts at secrecy, journalists swarmed the ship, leaving in their reporting little to the imagination. Captain Warden sought volunteers from warships in New York Harbor. He described to them the probable perils of passage and the certainty of combat. Many more enthusiastically responded than were required. "A better crew no naval commander ever had the honor to command," Warden would write later. But few of them had pre-war sea experience. Most were recent recruits with little or no maritime experience. Some were European immigrants, and at least 2 were African American. These volunteers endured ribbing from their fellow seamen. In a solemn and prophetic tone, one old salt proclaimed, "You fellows certainly got a lot of nerve or want to commit suicide, one or the other." Several of the volunteers took one look at Monitor and promptly deserted. But after a hurried and superficial testing, Monitor got underway for Hampton Roads on March 6, 1862. On the morning of Saturday, March 8th, as Monitor approached the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay, a frustrated commander-in-chief convened a council of war to prod Major General George B. McClellan into action on his proposed campaign to capture Richmond. He planned to land at Urbana on the Rappahannock, but as General Joe Johnston fell back from Manassas, McClellan decided instead to invade the peninsula at Fort Monroe. Throughout that afternoon, telegrams filtered in as the former USS Merrimack, now CSS Virginia, sallied forth into Hampton Roads. The Merrimack is close at hand. The Merrimack is engaging the Cumberland in close quarters. The Congress is now burning. For a while, the news looked very badly, recalled Presidential Secretary John Hay. Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton ordered the news be made public at once to alert northern ports that they were in great danger. The next morning, Sunday, March 9th, wrote a senior Treasury official, was as gloomy as any that Washington had experienced since the beginning of the war. Lincoln called an emergency session at the White House for a much alarmed cabinet. John Hay reported that the panic was intense at Willard's Hotel. Nothing was too wild to be believed. Presidential Secretaries John Hay and John Nicolay characterized this cabinet meeting as perhaps the most excited and impressive of the whole war. Gideon Welles was asked what could be done to counter this formidable monster. The Navy Secretary had no answers beyond faith in the untried Monitor. She should have arrived in Hampton Roads the day before, but due to a break in the telegraph cable, they had no news of her. Welles recorded in his diary that, quote, the most frightened man was Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. He was at times almost frantic. Stanton's words were broken and denunciatory. The panic under which he labored added to the apprehension of others. According to Welles, Stanton insisted the rebel ironclad would change the whole character of the war. She would destroy every naval vessel and take Fort Monroe. McClellan's campaign against Richmond must be abandoned. General Burnside's forces must be recalled from the North Carolina Sounds. The vital blockading base of Port Royal must be given up. Virginia would come up the Potomac, disperse Congress, destroy the capital. She might go to New York and Boston and destroy those cities and hold them for ransom. The Army Secretary was contemptuous of the notion that a two-gun iron raft could stop her. Secretaries Nicolay and Hay wrote that Stanton walked up and down the room like a caged lion. Secretary Chase was impatient. Welles and Seward were hopeful. McClellan was dumbfounded and silent. The president was, quote, as usual in trying moments, composed but eagerly inquisitive, critically scanning the dispatches, interrogating the officers, joining scrap to scrap of information, applying his searching analysis and clear logic to read the danger and find the remedy. Welles, in his diary, caustically described Stanton peering out the window with an expansive view down the Potomac, expecting a rebel shell to land in the White House before they left the room. The possibilities of the hour were indeed sufficiently pretentious to create consternation. But Welles assured them that Virginia was so loaded down with armor, she could not venture outside Hampton Roads. She could not, quote, ascend the river and surprise us with a cannonball. Certainly she could not attack simultaneously every city and harbor on the coast. It would better become us, Welles advised, to calmly consider the situation and inspire confidence by acting so far as we could, intelligently and with discretion and judgment. Stanton telegraphed governors in major cities in the north to man their forts and place timber rafts and other obstructions at the mouths of their harbors. Preparations were made to block the Potomac. That Sunday afternoon, the chattering telegraph finally produced the lost message the night before. Monitor had arrived and will take care of Virginia. The president and his cabinet awaited the outcome. In Hampton Roads that morning, the USS Minnesota was still hard aground, the crew making hasty preparations to abandon the ship with Monitor anchored nearby. Fog lifting from the water about 8 a.m. revealed the CSS Virginia approaching. Minnesota's captain declared to Monitor's Captain Worden, "If I cannot lighten my ship off the shoal, I shall destroy her." Worden assured him, "I will stand by you to the last if I can help you." "No, sir, you cannot help me," was the reply. Within the dim, claustrophobic metal drum of Monitor's turret, 20 feet in diameter, behind 8 inches of iron, squatted the 2 immense 11-inch Dahlgren smoothbores. Lieutenant Green supervised 16 brawny sailors packed in 8 to a gun. None of them had been drilled on these guns in the turret. Captain Worden took station on the pilot house platform near the bow, his head and shoulders in the iron box, peering through a half-inch viewing slit. Jammed at his elbow was the pilot and the helmsman. The only communication between pilot house and turret was via runners between the 2 stations on the deck below. Below the turret, recalled Paymaster Keeler, everyone was at his post, fixed like a statue. The most profound silence reigned. If there had been a coward heart there, its throb would have been audible, so intense was the stillness. I experienced a peculiar sensation. I do not think it was fear, but it was different from anything I ever knew before. We were enclosed in what we supposed to be impenetrable armor. We knew that a powerful foe was about to meet us. Ours was an untried experiment, and our enemy's first fire might make it a coffin for us all. The suspense was awful as we waited in the dim light, expecting every moment to hear the crash of our enemy's shot. Worden charged directly for Virginia, placing the little Monitor between Minnesota and the foe. In the gloom below, Keeler heard the muffled whump of a gun, then another and another. Virginia and Minnesota blasted away at each other at long range, skipping shells across the water's surface. Rounds could take 20 to 40 skips. Several friendly shots bounced off Monitor. Wrote Keeler, the infernal howl of the shells as they flew over our vessel was all that broke the silence and made it seem still more terrible. Captain Worden closed about 1/3 of a mile, altered course, and ordered, "Commence firing." The mammoth gunport cover rumbled open. The big black muzzle protruded. Lieutenant Green yanked the firelock at about 8:45 a.m. The entire structure throbbed and trembled with a deafening concussion as the 8-ton behemoth leapt inward. The rebel ironclad turned her head upstream and replied with a broadside, followed by a volume of musketry, which rattled on our iron deck like hailstones but caused no damage. These first shots made quite a sensation on worried gunners inside the turret. Worden expected that most rebel shots against the curved exterior would glance off without damage, but he worried that a shot fired directly in line with the vertical axis of the turret could deform the structure and jam the revolving mechanism. The captain also feared that hundreds of bolt and rivet heads holding together 8 layers of 1-inch iron plates would blast off, creating lethal projectiles inside the turret when hit outside. In either case, Monitor would be helpless. But he reported, a 150-pound projectile hitting straight on from 30 yards just created a smooth dent, a perfect mold of the shell 2.5 inches deep. The indentation carried right through 8 inches of plate without cracking or splitting the iron. To everyone's relief inside, the enemy fire did not dislodge a single rivet head, and the turret continued to revolve. One rebel shell struck the vulnerable deck edge and tore up one of the plates. Worried that the blow might open a seam below the waterline, Worden crawled out of the gun port, walked to the side, and lay down upon his chest to examine the damage, with bullets zinging off the iron deck as thick as hailstones in a storm. The hull was uninjured except for a few splinters of wood, so he crawled back into the turret. Worden announced to the crew that Virginia could not sink them if we let her pound us for a month. The men cheered. The guns bellowed through choking white smoke shot with flame. Rounds screamed, clanged, boomed, and splashed all around. The engines thumped and clanked. Blowers roared. Black clouds billowed from the stacks as the big propellers thrashed the water. The men trapped inside, many stripped to the waist with scraps of cloth around their ears, shouted, sweated, and struggled to manage their mental monsters. Virginia's Lieutenant H.P. Jones reported, "We were often within a ship's length of Monitor. Once while passing, we fired a broadside at her only a few yards distant. She and her turret appeared to be under perfect control. Her light draft enabled her to move about us at pleasure." Ironclad against ironclad, recalled Monitor's chief engineer Stimmers. "We maneuvered about the bay here and went at each other with mutual fierceness. They circled awkwardly in what would appear to a modern observer as slow motion. 5 times during the engagement, we touched each other," wrote Lieutenant Green, "and each time I fired a gun at Virginia. I will vouch the 168 pounds penetrated her sides. The shot, shell, grape, canister, musket, and rifle balls flew about us in every direction, but did us no damage. Our turret was struck several times, and though the noise was pretty loud, it did not affect us anyway." Inside the turret, 2 men leaned against the bulkhead, just as a rebel shot whanged against the outside, knocking them senseless and knocking one clean over the gun. Both recovered by the following morning, the only injuries among the crew. "The effect of one shut up in a revolving drum is perplexing," wrote Lieutenant Green. "Both vessels were continuously turning, backing, and forwarding, while the turret spun independently. This was not your traditional man-of-war gun deck." Green could see out only through the few-inch gap between the gun muzzle and the top of the gun port, a favorite target for eager muskets on Virginia. Through smoke, noise, concussion, and the whirling of the turret, the lieutenant was disoriented and frequently blind. He could not see the enemy. A rebel projectile entering an open gun port would put them out of action. He could not see how his guns were pointed relative to his own vessel. A careless round striking the pilot house directly in front of the turret would end the fight. To make matters worse, the steam-driven turret was slow to start, revolving, and once moving, slow to stop, even slower to reverse. Like all Monitor's machinery, these mechanisms were undergoing their first combat trial. Green found it nearly impossible to stop rotation in line of fire, open the gun port, sight, and shoot at a target that was itself moving. So he settled on a pattern. Rotate the turret away from Virginia and stop the load, leaving the gun ports open to save time and effort. Then, when ready, start revolving again and fire both guns on the fly as the target swept past the muzzles. Green personally aimed and fired every round. To Virginia's Lieutenant John Taylor Wood, Monitor appeared but a pygmy. But in her size was one great element of her success. The Monitor was firing every 7 or 8 minutes and nearly every shot struck. A Confederate Marine recalled, when Monitor's turret revolved, we could see nothing but 2 immense guns. Those guns bellowed and promptly disappeared while his gun crew struggled to respond. Lieutenant Jones wondered how the Yankees could take aim so quickly. But, he said, the Virginia, however, was a large target and generally so near that Monitor shot did not often miss. It did not appear to us that our shell had any effect upon the Monitor. Jones maneuvered his lumbering vessel for nearly an hour, trying to ram and board Monitor, but Worden turned away and suffered only a glancing blow. In the process, Monitor just missed Virginia's submerged stern, almost snapping off her rudder and propeller. But as Monitor slid by, Virginia delivered a 68-pound rifle shell against the pilot house from about 20 yards. Captain Worden's eyes were close behind the viewing slit. The explosion cracked and almost broke the iron box, flooding it with light. Paymaster Keeler stood below the platform awaiting orders. A flash of light and a cloud of smoke filled the house. I noticed the captain stagger and put his hands to his eyes. The blood was running from his face, which was blackened with the powder smoke. The pilot and the helmsman were shaken but not injured, while a stunned and partially blinded Worden ordered the helm to starboard, turning Monitor away from the action into shallow water where Virginia could not follow and her guns could not reach. My eyes, Worden said. I am blind, but do not mind me. Save the Minnesota if you can. Lieutenant Green came forward from the turret to assume command. Seeing Monitor withdraw, Minnesota's captain ordered every preparation to destroy the ship. But the rebel ironclad did not approach. Evening was descending. The tide was ebbing. Virginia was damaged and low on ammunition. Lieutenant Jones decided to retire, assuming that he could resume the contest the next day. Confederates would excoriate Jones for leaving Minnesota in enemy hands. Now in command of Monitor, Lieutenant Green longed to re-engage, but Virginia was retreating. He had to cover Minnesota. Another hit on the pilot house could be disabling, and their wounded captain needed attention. So at about 12:15, Monitor let go a few last shots and turned away. Green also would be criticized for this decision by armchair admirals. Paymaster Keeler climbed up through the iron hatch to a deck strewn with shell fragments. Virginia's parting shot shrieked over their heads and exploded about 100 feet away. Small steamers and boats from Newport News, Fort Monroe, and the various men of war surrounded them. All eager to learn the extent of our injuries and congratulate us on our victory, he wrote. Thousands of spectators were astonished to learn that Monitor was essentially uninjured and ready to resume the fight. Aboard Minnesota, Assistant Secretary of the Navy Gustavus Fox had seen the whole fight. He hailed down to Monitor from the high deck that they had fought the greatest naval battle on record and behaved as gallantly as men could. Wrote Lieutenant Green to his parents, I felt proud and happy then, Mother, and felt fully repaid for all that I had suffered. When told that Minnesota was saved, Worden said, then I can die happy. Future Admiral John Worden would recover most of the sight in his right eye, but his face was permanently blackened and his left eye destroyed. Monitor was struck 22 times, twice on the pilot house, 9 on the turret, 8 in the side armor, and 3 on deck. Lieutenant Green was black with smoke and powder down to his underclothes. His nervous system was shot. Every bone ached. He could hardly stand. My nerves and muscles twitched as though electric shocks were continually passing through them. My head ached as if it would burst. Sometimes I thought my brain would come out right over my eyebrows. I lay down and tried to sleep. Might as well have tried to fly. Thank you. I'm ready for questions.
Okay, do we have any questions out there?
Yeah, this is Jeff. Can you hear me?
Yeah, very fine.
I'm gonna so they could change the direction that the turret rotated in?
Yeah, well, it was a matter of stopping it.
Mm-hmm.
You had to stop it completely and get it moving back in the right directions. And it was they had 2 small auxiliary steam engines right under the turret, fed from the boilers, and like reciprocating steam engines. The way they work to change to go forward or back is to stop the steam pushing from one side of the piston and start it, close those valves and then open the valves so the steam comes in the other end of the piston, which is a slow process. So it as you can imagine, it was pretty cumbersome. And of course, this time, first time anyone ever tried it in combat.
Okay, thank you.
Say, Dwight, did the Confederates really think that through, that the Virginia could only really operate there in Hampton Roads?
Well, the sailors knew it. The commanding officer and the sailors knew that and the designers, the guys that built it knew that it probably couldn't operate outside Hampton Roads. For one thing, the engines were very shaky. They'd been on the bottom of the river for a while before they raised her and recovered her, and they were not reliable even before then. And she was so low in the water and heavy with iron, and she couldn't go far from a naval base where she could be repaired. So they know she couldn't leave, but the naval, both the secretaries of the Navy on both sides had grand plans for her. The Confederate Secretary of the Navy, Mallory, wanted her to do just what Secretary of War Stanton feared she would do, and that is go up the coast, attack New York and Boston and all that. And of course Wells and his Assistant Secretary Fox, got some of those ideas in their heads too, but it didn't work that way. I'm not hearing this person.
Somebody else have a question?
Yes, go ahead.
This is John C.
Go ahead, John C.
Did the Monitor use half powder charges?
Yes, it did. That's an interesting, one of the fascinating what ifs. There are several what ifs of this battle. One is that the Navy Department, Secretary Wells, ordered him to use only 15-pound half charges going into this battle, because they'd never really fired these guns in combat. They did test them a couple times, but didn't really have a chance to work with them much. And they didn't really know for sure what was going to happen in this little iron box or iron tube. And so just to be cautious, he ordered him to use 15-pound charges. Well, after the battle, they pretty well, Warden particularly, and a lot of these seamen thought that if he'd have used full charges, he might have penetrated Virginia's armor. And actually, later on, they did use full charges without problem. So that's one of the what ifs. There's a corresponding one on the Confederate side, because Virginia came out into Hampton Roads thinking she was going against wooden warships. So she stocked up mostly with exploding shells, which of course are devastating against wooden hulls. But they discovered that the shells didn't work quite as well against iron, because they would explode on the surface, and their power would disperse on the surface without penetrating, and that round shot or heavy solid shot had more penetrating power. And they claim on their side that if they had had more shot as opposed to shell, that they would have penetrated Monitor's armor. So it goes back and forth.
Thank you.
Hey, Dwight, John Canister here. I wrote a book and meeting you at the Emerging Civil War conference last August. And I particularly like the end or the back of the book where you included kind of a tour of the harbor area, which is pretty unique since most of our battlefields you tour on grass and things like that. And this is on water. So my question to you is, are there adequate interpretive signs along the harbor's edge, kind of the equivalent of a Civil War trails with, maps and photos and things like that? If so, is there a route, or do you suggest going going clockwise like your book, or can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. Well, yes, that tour, putting that tour together was fun, and that's part of the advantages of this Emerging Civil War series, is that they all do maps, but of course this wasn't your typical battle map.
Right.
You can visit their 6 or 8 points on the map, I forget. You can actually visit those points in whatever order is convenient for you. But if you, the place you really should try to see is the Monitor Center. And there's another appendix on the Monitor Center at the Naval Museum at Newport News. It is a magnificent place with full mock-ups of both ships and the turret and all sorts of great information. And they have the Monitor's propeller and her engine, and you can see the mock-ups of the turret. You can see the actual turret in her bath of preserving fluid. there are some signs along the waterfront, along that drive from the Monitor Center up to Fort Monroe, and there are a couple good stopping places there where you can view the water. And then Fort Monroe is another good place, and then the various museums spots that we talk about over in Norfolk. The Navy Yard Museum is a small museum, but it's a very good one. So you kind of go wherever works best for you.
Right. I was curious about those interpretive signs, as if you're walking, let's say, the Chancellorsville battlefield, there might be a dozen signs, that you could look at. Can you equivalently do the same thing along the water's edge? Not necessarily talking about museums, but Yeah,
there aren't many. There's, as I recall, there's a very nice outlook spot about halfway down that drive that fronts the water. And it has a couple signs, but they tell you this is where it took place, but there isn't a lot of detail. So
okay.
You won't find a lot of detail on the signs, no.
All right. And do you have another book in the works, Dwight?
Oh yeah, and more after that, I hope. I'm working on putting together a compilation of blog posts and essays going back a number of years on Navy subjects, just a little bit of this and that and everything as part of the Emerging Civil War 10th Anniversary Series. And I'm hoping that'll be out later this year if we can get it together.
Great, thank you.
Not really a question, but just a comment, Dwight. A couple of years ago, I found myself at the Navy Memorial and had a long train ride ahead of me and was looking for something to read. And I picked up a copy of your Confederate biography on the Shenandoah. And I just want to tell you how much I enjoyed that book. I would highly recommend that read to anyone out there. That's an outstanding book.
Well, thank you for the plug. I appreciate it.
You can send the check.
Dwight, I have another question for you.
Sure.
Yeah, I have another question.
Go ahead, John.
Dealing with Confederate. Mark Thompson, why don't you go ahead since I've already asked a question?
You're muted, Mark.
There we go.
There we go.
Took me a while to figure it out. I enjoyed this presentation a great deal. Thank you so much for bringing it to us this evening. Your comments just a couple of minutes ago got me to thinking here, and my question is actually going to be related to Virginia. So I hope that's not an unfair question, but this is where it came from. You talked about the Monitor's armament that morning. You talked about how it was the captain's idea or concept that he would be facing an overwhelming number of wooden ships. I'm wondering, from a situational awareness standpoint, have you ever read anything indicating just how surprised the Confederate captain or the crew of Virginia were to see Monitor that morning? I mean, obviously rumors about Virginia's activity had everybody spun up in Washington, but I'm just wondering when Virginia made its way out into Hampton Roads that morning and saw Monitor, how exactly surprised they were. Thank you.
Well, they were, they didn't know that she came in that night, but they were not entirely surprised because they expected her. The officers did anyway. The crew probably would have known about that, but there wasn't much in the way of secrecy on either side, and everybody sort of knew what was going on. They knew Monitor had been launched. They knew she was under testing. They expected her any time. And actually, that's one of the reasons Virginia, the Flag Officer Buchanan, who was in command of Virginia, was so anxious to get out there and do some damage before Monitor got there.
So that attack on the 8th, then, at that point, Buchanan was feeling she's going to be showing up, so I need to get out here and do something, right?
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. He had actually hoped to get out a couple of days before, but there was a storm came through, and the same storm actually almost sank Monitor as she came down, and that delayed him. And he was scrambling even just to get her finished. There were workers still working on Virginia when she got underway. He just kicked them all off and got himself underway. And she was mostly, but not entirely completed. She didn't have the gun port covers on the broadsides, for instance. So there wasn't any way to cover the gun ports. There were other items that hadn't been completed, but he decided he was going to get out there as quickly. So that's what he did.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Dwight.
Hey, Dwight.
Yeah.
Charlie. The Virginia didn't come out the next day. How badly damaged was it?
Well, they had blown most of the gear, most of the accoutrements off the top of the ship, and pretty well hold the smokestack. Actually, you can see in that picture, there's not much of a stack there. So they had to fix her up some, and they had a couple damaged guns, and they had to rearm her, get some more ammunition aboard, and just kind of generally fix her up. I mean, most of the damage was relatively minor, but it would take some time to do. So they did that, and of course, Monitor just kind of hung around and cleaned herself up some, but she didn't have any significant damage either. And then Virginia came out several times more and tried to re-engage Monitor, but the Navy authorities said, no, don't engage Virginia because we don't want to take any more chances with Monitor, but just keep her out of action. So that's what they did until finally the Union recaptured Norfolk in the Navy Yard, and the Confederates had to blow Virginia up because she couldn't go anywhere. Wasn't any way to get out to sea effectively, and she couldn't get up the river because she was too deep. So that's what happened to her.
Anybody else?
Dwight, I have another question for you concerning Confederate commerce raiders, which was brought up. You wrote a book on the CSS Shenandoah, and I recently heard a phrase, and I don't know if there's much truth to it at all, which is kind of my question to you. And the phrase that I heard was that the Confederate commerce raiders helped to save the whales, and that the commerce raiders hurt the whaling fleet so much that the insurance rates for the whaling fleets went up, and the North turned to other fuels like kerosene and whatnot. Would you say that the whaling was already on the way out, or is there any truth to that?
Well, actually read the book. Shenandoah disperses and practically destroys the North Pacific whaling fleet after Appomattox, after essentially the war had ended, and she does a great deal of damage to the fleet, and sort of pretty much destroyed that whole season for them. That was not the only factor in the decline of whaling, but it certainly didn't help. In 1870 something, they had another whole big bunch of whalers get locked in ice, and they were lost too. Kerosene was invented in 1862, and that started taking over. So yes, the industry was well over its peak and generally in decline at the time. Shenandoah gave him a nudge, though, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you, Dwight.
Okay. Well, Dwight, thank you very much. That was very interesting. I learned a ton particularly about the Monitor that I was certainly unaware of. Thank you for your presentation.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, and I have nothing further. Anybody else, anything you want to bring up tonight?
Yeah, this is your beloved Vice President talking. Two things real quick. One, of course, because our membership is so knowledgeable, if anyone wants to get in contact with me for speaking in 2023 to the group as a whole, feel free to email me or just talk to me directly at the next meeting, which is the second thing, which is our next meeting will be on March 14th, either at Brock's Riverside Grill at the regular dinner meeting, or we'll be back to Zoom meeting. We haven't quite made that decision yet. Our speaker will be Scott Mingus, and his topic will be Targeted Tracks, Cumberland Valley Railroad in the Civil War.
Scott's a good speaker.
Thank you all for coming, and hopefully we'll see you next month, hopefully in person.